Well, I'm very happy to present our next speaker, who will present on monsoons and mythic rivers, Mona Bhan from Syracuse University. Mona Bhan is Ford Maxwell Professor of South Asian Studies in the Department of Anthropology at Syracuse University, a co-founder of the Critical Kashmir Studies Collective. Bhan is the author of Counterinsurgency, Development, and the Politics of Identity from Warfare to Welfare. I am going to let Mona define the ways in which this is a collaborative paper, I believe, from reading it with Radhika Govindrajan, but I will leave that up to you to address. So without further ado, welcome Mona Bhan to present on monsoons and mythic rivers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's such a pleasure. I've learned so much from being part of the reading groups and really honored to be here. This is a collaborative project with Radhika Govindrajan, but the title of the paper is not what you see on the screen. It's also not what you see in the schedule. The title of the paper is Saraswati's Disappearance and Climate Theories of the Hindu Right. So today's paper, entitled Saraswati's Disappearance and Climate Theories of Hindu Right, with Radhika Govindrajan, who unfortunately couldn't be here, draws from and builds on our other co-authored paper entitled More Than Human Fascism, which is forthcoming in American Anthropologist next year. Our AA paper examines the Hindu rights claims that theirs is a project fueled by the vital political agency of entities like mountains and rivers who are understood as primordially Hindu. Some of the key questions the paper addresses are these. How might our analysis of fascism be enriched if we turn our attention to how contemporary supremacist movements self-fashion themselves as more than human formations? How do right-wing supremacist assertions that theirs is an indigenous, more than human politics support the framing of fascism as a decolonizing project? And how is fascism politics or fascist politics naturalized through claims that it's fueled by the agency and vitality of not just humans, but also other than human entities? Our paper today turns to a preliminary examination of the ways in which climate narratives can bolster Hindu civilizational imaginaries in troubling ways. We focus particularly on how climate and Hinduism come to be related in the environmental discourses of the Hindu right in India, but also in the diaspora. In what follows, we'll focus on how scientific and popular discourses that frame the disappearance of the mythic river Saraswati, which was first mentioned in the Vedas, how they frame it as a climate event. The disappearance itself is framed as a climate event, and that's something that really piqued our interest and allowed us to sort of build on earlier conversations that we've been having for the last few years. But before we get there, let us say something about how the Hindu right claims that India's primordial Hindu past can offer climate wisdom for the globe in this moment of crisis. We show how the narratives of the Hindu right, both state narratives as well as more entrepreneurial, decolonized ones, posit Hindu India specifically as both a victim and a resilient survivor of climate change. In doing so, they blend Vedic and historic temporalities and draw as much from science as they do from the Shastras to offer locally situated climate wisdom. In these narratives, the environment emerges as an article of faith. That was Modi's quote in the White House during his recent visit to the US. And so the emergence of the environment, thus, as an article of faith, blurs the distinctions, we argue, between the secular, the scientific, and the religious, an intersection that Bhanu Subramaniam has also examined in her stellar book, Holy Science. Climate is at the heart of the Modi government's diplomacy offensive. As early as 2015, 1 year into his first term as prime minister, Modi argued, quote, "India should be a global leader in the fight against climate change. It is that is it that the world will guide us in climate change and we'll follow them? The world sets the parameters and we follow them? No, it's not like that, end quote. This emphasis on the leading role that India can play in addressing climate change seeps into the everyday political discourse as well. For example, an article in the Sunday Guardian about Prime Minister Modi's show on India and environment, the Man Ki Baat show. K. Siddhartha, a self-described strategic thinker and earth scientist, argues that, quote, India is at the cusp of bringing about some major transformations in the ways the world thinks and perceives about its environmental-related issues. It is actually at the cusp of change to unleash new knowledge to the world, cleanse the world of infodemics on climate change. I don't know what that is. Whether weave the world communities into making the earth a livable, sustainable, and more beautiful place. And with Prime Minister Narendra Modi at the helm, anything is possible, you know. Modi hai to mumkin hai. India is in a position to take leadership of cleaning the world, in preserving local wisdom and knowledge, weaving indigenous people with technology, and making the historical knowledge gained through millennia get identified, respected, and implemented by the world, end quote. Being a 15,000-year-old civilization, Siddharth goes on, India can play a pivotal role in not only ending the suffering of indigenous people, but utilizing their knowledge and experience for the whole world. Elsewhere, I've termed this claim of the right-wing Hindus as a font of deep knowledge and vision as Hindu exceptionalism, something we saw obviously also mobilized during the COVID pandemic in India. Insofar as these relate to climate change, or this idea of Hindu exceptionalism relates to climate change interventions, they are rooted in the idea that India offers a democratic, participatory solution to the pressing problems of climate emergency, unlike China, for example, where a prescriptive model of tackling the climate crisis makes the government's approach authoritarian and non-participatory. Further, unlike the US religious right, which denies the existence of climate change, the Hindu right claims a historical experience and religious scientific grasp of climate change that is at the heart of its role as a global leader. This is but one example of how claims about India's long-standing indigenous wisdom can stop the ongoing climate catastrophe in its tracks. Our examination of how the Hindu right conceives of solutions to climate change complicates scholarly and activist claims that situated narratives of climate emergencies can always offer place-based, political, and historically grounded narratives that meaningfully address ongoing and imminent catastrophes. As the quote above exemplifies, these local narratives, because these commentators claim that India is, of course, local on the global stage, and that their perspective, the perspective that Hindus offer is indigenous. They have universal, so there's this claim that these local narratives therefore have universal applicability. Our broad intervention is that the local is not a panacea, but can instead entrench and sanction forms of exclusion that go unrecognized when they're brought to a global stage. We talk below about how such discourses of Hindu indigeneity are circulating in the West in uncritical ways that invisibilize their violence against religious minorities and lower caste groups in India, and of course, other marginal places. Thus, instead of taking these as a priori solutions, we suggest that localized narratives on climate change must be subject to scrutiny in the same way as universalizing narratives that center a common human experience. Two quick notes before we get into the bulk of the paper. One, who composes the Hindu right? I know I've been using that as a very sort of capacious category, which it is. And that's how we are deploying it in the paper. So for us, it includes state actors, vigilante groups, NGOs, there's policy, think tanks in India, in the US, in the UK, and other places. There's academics, there's corporations. A really expansive, diffuse network that Sahana Udupa's work actually is useful to keep in mind as we consider how to map this complex landscape. Udupa shows how what she calls enterprise Hindutva is argumentative. It's experientially voluntary and capable of working with contradictions, end quote. For us too, it is important to consider how differently situated actors deploy a range of ideas, histories, methods, and genres to frame Hindutva climate knowledge around climate change as a range rather than a point of convergence. Udupa's words. Climate change claims thus inhabit and crisscross multiple worlds and offer mediatized forms of Hindu globality. For example, the ways climate narratives tend to materialize a mythic river, such as Saraswati, and render it real, differs across these actors. We can't, obviously, for a lack of time, I can't go over every aspect of how the Saraswati is materialized. For example, the scientific discourses, archaeology records, so on and so forth, but I'll focus on a few today. While geologists and archaeologists, as I said, deploy scientific dating methods, popular voices on YouTube and social media conflate Vedic with historic timelines to frame the disappearance of Saraswati as a climate event. I'll come back to that just in a moment. But second point, what is at stake in claiming Hindu history as climate history is one of the questions that that motivated us to write the paper. And more specifically, what kinds of violence do such narratives, which claim to offer radically inclusive solutions to climate change, conceal and authorize? Scholars have discussed the nature of this violence. There's Ambika Ayudurai's work, Prashant Ingole, Dolly Kikon, Mukul Sharma. All of them have examined in different ways the ways in which the understanding of Hindu is rooted in caste and gender violence, as well as the exclusion of Muslims, and how it operates through environmental registers in particular. One example is the Tehri Dam agitation, which, as Mukul Sharma, Emmy Maudsley, and others have shown, relied on arguments about Hindu ecology and were deeply exclusionary. Another example is from our joint work, from the paper that I mentioned earlier, where you see that some cow protectionists frame their violent project as a climate intervention. Of course, we don't need to belabor here about the hideous violence of cow protection in India. I'm sure we're all very familiar with that. But in our shared paper, Govind Rajan follows a guru called Rakesh Samwal, who makes a case that climate change is an outcome of cow slaughter. Every time a cow screams, she rips a hole in the ozone layer. This might be laughable, but the book was released by a senior member of the Uttarakhand BJP. You can see how those who slaughter the cow become responsible for climate change. This is a local narrative, what Nayanika Mathur might also call conspiratorial theorizing of climate change. But such climate theories are finding wide audiences, especially among those in the West, who seek solutions to climate change in religion and theology. I'd like to dwell on one example at length. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Thank you. Oh, is this because of this?
Yeah,
Or maybe it's just in my, is it part of the picture?
I'm not sure. Wait, trying to zoom. Let me just.
Please don't look at the number of files open on my, that's an embarrassment, but I had no time to actually shut those down.
Okay. All right.
I think it's in the, it's sort of embedded,
Yeah.
sadly.
Okay.
Yeah. I think it's a screenshot.
Yeah,
that's
well,
it.
it's the screen.
You can't
we're
help
trying to
it.
do.
Sorry.
Okay.
I've been exposed.
Is that?
That's fine. It works for me. I hope that's okay. And I hope you can focus on the middle part.
Sorry, I apologize for the technical errors. Trying to
That's good.
get things to work here. Okay.
Thank you, Daniel. I think that's good. Yeah. Um, so yeah, as I said, we want to dwell on one example at length here. In an academic conference on religion and climate change at Yale in February of 2019, several speakers talked about why Hinduism was naturally suited to lay out a theological and practical framework for collective action. Quote, the Hindu Earth Ethics and Climate Action Conference at Yale was the culmination, this is a report based on the conference, was the culmination of months of work in bringing together climate activists, leaders, academics, and policymakers who are also Hindu in order to claim a mantle of leadership in fighting what many call an existential threat to humanity and the world, end quote. Gopal Patel, the executive director of the Bhumi Project, a UK-based Hindu climate action group, and one of the conference's organizers, argued that Hindu scriptural teachings on seeing the divinity in all beings could be at the foundation of everyday action in fighting climate change and global warming. What climate change presents, Patel said at the conference, is answering the question at the heart of Hinduism. What does it mean to be a person in the world? Patel noted that followers of Hinduism and other dharmic religions like Buddhism have long argued a different model than those of Abrahamic faith in combating climate change. That's because, he says, rather than looking at climate change from a matter of human rights, Hindu philosophy prioritizes the idea that all life has rights. So what's our intervention here? We argue, of course, that these discourses of personhood offered to all animate beings resonates with discourses of indigeneity as ethical practice for the Anthropocene, according to Kohn, even though, as our work has shown, the politics, and the work of many others has shown, the politics of the Hindu right often relies on the dehumanization and the extermination of particular groups. Another space in which Hindu climate thinking has exploded is the digital media space. We are interested in webinars and talk shows, and here, for the remaining time that I have, we'll explore digital media production on the Saraswati in particular, and how that is tied to climate change. But before getting to that, let me just quickly provide some context to Saraswati in case people are unfamiliar with that. So Irfan Habib's work is quite instructive here because what he's dealt with is this phenomenon he calls the Saraswati mania in India. Mythic accounts of the Saraswati's centrality to the cultural evolution of the Indian subcontinent, he argues, has fueled multiple contemporary scientific efforts to resurrect the river, whether through extensive topographical and archaeological surveys, digital analysis of satellite images, water aging tests to track the story of its disappearance, or the physical diversion of water from state tube wells into water channels that are claimed to be associated with the lost river. As historians have noted, this right-wing obsession with rediscovering the Saraswati is connected to Hindu supremacist anxieties about the loss of India's ancient Hindu territory due to partition. Habib thus asserts that the transfer of major sites of the Harappan Indus civilization to Pakistan posed an existential problem for the Sangh Parivar, or the family of Hindu supremacist organizations headed by the RSS, because it meant that Pakistan must then have the Saraswati, or claims to the Harappan civilization. So that's why there's still a huge push within the Hindu right in India to reclaim the Harappan civilization or the Indus civilization as the Saraswati civilization. And that has a temporal logic to it, which I hope to explore shortly. While some right-wing ideologues and institutions responded to this dilemma by seeking the origins of the Saraswati elsewhere in India, for example, in the northern Indian state of Haryana, because that's where ongoing efforts that have been going on now since 2014 have been to reclaim or re-energize the Saraswati and really sort of pump water into that paleo channel so that you can recreate the river. Others have more recently assigned to Saraswati, as I said, the duty of winning the Indian civilization the Indus civilization for India. For this patriotic purpose, Habib explains, the Saraswati must be conceived to have been at least 5,000 years old, one of the great rivers of the world, flowing down to the Rann of Kutch, parallel to the Indus. The Indus Valley civilization, whose two major cities, Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, unfortunately lie in Pakistan, can then be renamed the Saraswati civilization. And on that grounds, can be claimed eventually for India. And that's why, if you've been following these initiatives, there's this push to reclaim the Dholavira site in India as the sort of site of the Saraswati civilization, because those are in India. And there's multiple other sites, and they keep rediscovering other sites and claim them to be part of the Harappan civilization. As we noted earlier, the feminist scholar of science, Bhanu Subramaniam, argues the idea that science and religion, against this idea, right, that science and religion are oppositional categories. And she argues that this opposition does not quite capture the ways in which they're intricately entangled in Hindu supremacist thought and practice. The search for the Saraswati is undergirded by a Hindu science that densely and intricately blends the past with the present, modernity with orthodoxy, and science with religion. Not simply the loss of any river, the disappearance of the Saraswati, the cradle of the Hindu civilization, is viewed as a catastrophic climate event that had debilitating implications for Hindu historic continuity and consciousness. And that's the intervention we're making. There's lots been done on Saraswati and its disappearance and how it's being regenerated, so on and so forth. But its framing as a climate event, I think, has interesting implications for what's happening with Hindu consciousness and perceptions of climate change in general. This catastrophic event is represented as having produced in Hindus a deep, situated knowledge of the environment, an entity with personhood that is offered as a gift to the world. How does Saraswati's history then become climate history? And how does climate history become Hindu history? We show how the discussion of the Saraswati's disappearance as an early example of climate change collapses the geological with the civilizational, the secular with the religious, as I've said, and the Vedic with the scientific. Claims about the Saraswati are framed as geological claims, but they are constantly interspersed with arguments about India's civilizational greatness. And geological temporal categories are collapsed with these, as I show you in a second, with these temporal categories derived from the Vedas. So climate history and Hindu civilizational history come to be intertwined in ways that underscores the deep time horizons of Hindu climate knowledge. So what does it look like in practice? So I focus here on Mr. Nilesh Oak. He's a US-based engineer and self-proclaimed historian. And of course, I just wanted you to see how he represents himself. There's a lot to his biography that I could go on and on for, but in any case, he's a US-based engineer and self-proclaimed historian who in an hour-long, and he has several YouTube clips. It could take me a year to just watch them and transcribe them. But for now, I'm focusing on this hour-long YouTube clip that has around 50K views, where Nilesh Oak begins by offering a history of climate change in India using maps and graphs and timelines to establish India's civilizational antiquity. So unlike Irfan Habib, who says, we need to only establish, or the Hindu right only needs to establish the Hindu civilization as 5,000 years old in order to claim Saraswati civilization as its own, here he says, the first slide, he claims that every Indian should safely claim 24K plus years of Indian antiquity. But for that, he needs to answer this key question about the presence of water in the region. So he says, but people claim, do they have water back then? Did they have water back then? Because and by the way, don't expect any kind of logical sequencing here, because there's not much logic here, right? There's logical leaps. So I'll point those out as I speak, but it is sort of interesting to follow the thread to finally arrive at what some of his key interventions are. So he cautions his listeners to ignore mistakes that he claims are even made by pro-India scholars, not folks like us, but also pro-India scholars who believe that if we go back to 10,000 years in history, we'll find it's the Holocene, it's the Ice Age, right? And therefore, there's no water, right? So this is an interesting slide in his presentation where what he's claiming is those portions that are that have been blackened out are the only regions of the world that experienced freezing temperatures in the Ice Age. So the green parts, right, that you see, which is where India is, did not actually experience that age at all. He claims that scholars assume that there's ice, everyone is freezing to death, and nothing else is possible in India. One of the main questions they ask is, where is the water? They say, where is the land? Where is the forest? Where is the grass? After setting his audience up for what is to come, Oak shows a map of a dried up Indian subcontinent and asks folks to focus on the northern part of Bharatvarsha, which he points is flat and shows a deltaic landscape with multiple streams and rivers crisscrossing this land. So if you look at it, again, I have no idea where he got the map from, but this is what it is. So you have this very flat looking, what he claims to be a deltaic landscape. And he then says, notice how flat the landscape is, because if you see this, you will understand why the name of the river is Satluj or Shatudri. Shatudri means millions of streams, he argues. Don't tell me how he got to Shatudri from Saraswati. We'll come to that in a second. It was likely only one stream at the time, but what you are seeing is in this picture are paleo channels. And then he makes this big claim, very situated claim that anthropologists love to make, that all the names have histories embedded in it, he says. The river Shatudri is not an ordinary name, he claims. It is not a random name that anybody gave, right? It has, no, he says, no. It has in it the history of civilization, antiquity of civilization trapped into it. In fact, it was a prominent tributary of Saraswati. That's how Shatudri comes up, or that's why Satluj comes up, because it was the most prominent tributary of Saraswati. The greatness of Ma Saraswati is because of Shatudri, he says. Then he has this thing where he has quotes from the Mahabharata and the Rig Vedas sort of mapped onto what you see a very kind of scientific, map. Oak then jumps to yet another point, which is meant to stretch the existence of Saraswati to a prior time. And this he goes back to 100,000 to 150,000 years. Forget Habib. Habib is still in the 5,000-year realm. Basically claiming that we had water even then. And he keeps going on and on, showing it with maps and graphs. And then he says, but at 24,000 mark, a climate event intervened to disrupt and shrink the flows of Mahasaraswati. The last glacial maximum finally happened. The ice was starting to freeze, seasons were changing, the glaciers were not melting, and Mahasaraswati became the Saraswati. The river was still big, but it was not as big as described in the Rig Veda. It is unclear in his presentation, this is another timeline, it is unclear in his presentation how the Saraswati finally disappeared, although he refers to it shrinking to its diminished form some 24,000 years ago due to climate change. In the interest of time, I'm just moving on from Oak now. In the interest of time, I want to point to yet another persistent theme across discourses around Saraswati's disappearance. It centers on the ability of early Aryans, and Aryans, by the way, are the indigenous inhabitants of India, according to right-wing discourses. I can respond to that in the Q&A session if there are questions. But the idea is that it centers on the ability of early Aryans to adapt to a massively changed climate that led to the disappearance of their spiritual and economic anchor, the Saraswati. Their socioeconomic and ecological resilience is demonstrated, for instance, by their relocation to less urban environments. So while the Saraswati disappeared, the Aryans survived in India. That's the claim. So it is this early example of climate adaptation by Aryans that offers a deep climate wisdom at a time when climate catastrophes are making life so precarious on Earth. So it's not just about climate change, but it's also a very good illustration of climate adaptations by early Aryans. To conclude, such civilizational wisdom derived from Hindu scriptures and mythic events shape how Hindu fascist practices are often dressed up as deep climate knowledge, something that we have also addressed in our prior work. Cow protectionism thus becomes a climate ethic as Muslims and other minorities are attacked for not following the tenets of the Hindu faith. For example, Sadhguru, or Sadhguru as some people call him, who's emerged as a key Hindu spiritual leader in India, explained to Barkhadat how in such a spiritual land as India, one can find religious ceremonies taking place at any time and any place. Spiritual yagnas are fire ceremonies that perform to thank the gods and receive their blessings. Cows even play a central role in these fire yagnas or agnihotras. Scientific research has found that the ritual of burning cow dung and ghee as fuel for these sacred fires actually purifies the air and has anti-pollutant and anti-radiation qualities in the environment, end quote. At the same time, while violence in the name of cow protection or easy stereotypes about Abrahamic faiths not respecting all life around, unlike the Hindu faith, India is also expanding its role in climate diplomacy and its bid to assert its role as a Vishwa Guru on the global stage. In our paper today, we've largely discussed cultural production, digital and otherwise, but Modi's policy interventions have also drawn in very similar logics, and that's the scary part. For example, Modi's One Sun, One World Grid initiative put forth by him at the first assembly of the International Solar Alliance in October 2018 is one such initiative that leverages India's civilizational wisdom to build a global green economy. In his 94th edition of Man Ki Baat, aired on October 30th, 2022, Modi foregrounds how the festival of Chhath, which was being celebrated across parts of India on that day, how that festival signifies our reverence for the Lord Sun, solar energy. Solar energy is a subject today, he claims, in which the whole world is looking at its future. And for India, the Lord Sun has been at the center of not only worship, but also it's a way of life for centuries. Today, India is connecting its traditional experiences with modern science, which is why today we've become one of the largest countries making electricity from solar energy. End quote. With 67 countries and more, actually, by now, countries as members, the policy initiative commentators have claimed has become India's calling card on climate change. The Hindu rights diplomacy claims, or climate diplomacy claims, as a foreign policy tool to respond to China's One Belt, One Road initiative, and that's kind of the argument we're making. And therefore, we argue that it's yet another imperial claim to reconfigure the world and establish India's status as a global teacher or a Vishwa Guru. Hindu supremacy offers its fascist cosmopolitics as a decolonial solution to environmental decline and global climate change, a claim that resonates in seemingly unexpected circles at a time when discourses of neoliberal indigenous spirituality that fetishize Hinduism as a nature-loving way of life leave little room to explore and examine its violent political dimensions. Thank you.